Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Warcraft video. Classic is still WoW, and that does mean that add-ons are supported. They have been supported from day one. So today we're going to cover our recommendations and our warnings, all to help your Classic experience. And today's video is brought to you by Patreon, where we are running our Classic-themed month. In addition to the regularly scheduled Paladin month, you're also getting two super lovely nostalgic landscapes that I think you'll love, plus shipping is included too. So that's going on over there. And let's get into the video. There's a lot to be said about the Classic spirit, the spirit of Classic, and that meaning different things to different people. There's basically two different focuses here: the game as it was meant to be experienced and the personal experiences of players at the time. Using any add-ons from the modern era, that will lessen the nostalgic factor, but there are many that keep the game itself almost intact while, smoothing out some of the issues. If you're playing the game for nostalgia more than for playing Classic in a new light, then you'll probably have a better idea of what add-ons you used back then than I will. But more generally though, while add-ons are designed to increase quality of life for players and sometimes to add new features, there can be a fine line between making the game better to play and making the game less like vanilla. Your mileage may vary, but in today's video I'm going to run you through some add-ons that I believe are vital and will ease some of the pain points of Classic without causing any harm to the core of the Classic experience. First off, one of my favorites, LeatrixPlus Classic. By default, this add-on does a little bit too much, so I'll recommend it with a caveat. So disable the automation of quests and gossip. Definitely disable that. Beyond that though, having simple features like blocking unwanted requests, auto-accepting invites from friends or guildies, auto-vendoring, auto-repairing, and the faster loot speed, I think they're quite nice. This is basically just a sort of best of quality of life sort of compilation in a single add-on. It's really great, and it's even got options like disabling certain screen effects to reduce nausea in afflicted players, which is kind of interesting. So it's a pretty good bet. Then in the same vein, we've got advanced interface options. Having access to tweaking the client and all of its available options is just helpful for players who want to fiddle a little bit more. There's nothing extremely important here, but having old options being restored, as well as the UI for CVARs, is extremely helpful across the board, especially for tweaking the game's floating combat text. Then for action bars, there's Bartender 4. Much like it's always been, Bartender remains the go-to for moving and customizing action bars without going for a full UI overhaul like Elv or Tuck. Many people will consider the Blizzard action bars, Griffins included, to be part of the Classic experience, but not everyone shares that opinion, and add-ons like this were commonplace back in the day. Next, let's cover combat fundamentals, where there are quite a few, some I would deem necessary and others less so. We'll start with OmniCC. Knowing exactly when your spells and your items will come off cooldown, that's far from game-breaking, so I think there's no conceivable reason not to use this add-on. It could be a little bit offensive visually, but that's easy to fix, and overall it is just great information to have. Then a combat add-on that we would be unlikely to need outside of Classic is Weapon Swing Timer. This is very important for melee classes, especially those who are using slower swing time weapons, where it really is useful to know exactly when your next attack is going to be. Unlike today, there's a ton of downtime in combat, and that means you have to stretch your limited mechanics further. One major way to tell a seasoned player from a newer one in Classic is if they use a swing timer and how they use it. You can say, slow an enemy, attack, get out of range until your swing timer is about to be ready, then hit the enemy. The idea there is to stay out of range until your attack is ready, minimizing the amount of time that you are getting hit without actually hitting back. Now, this is possible to do without an add-on if you can keep the rhythm and the timing yourself, but it's, much easier to do with an add-on, and things like this were very commonplace back in the day, and it's also especially useful in more stressful situations like unexpected world PvP. And then as for the usual combat suspects, we have details. Of course, DPS meters have been a norm for a very long time. It's always good to manage your damage output, and right now details is the one to use these days. Some of its modern features may have less of a place in Classic, but the core functionality in details is really good, and it even has a skin that lets it fit right into the WoW UI perfectly. Then next up, we've got our boss mods. So deadly boss mods, Classic or Bigwigs are your ones to go with. Both of these appear to be missing some functionality for the time being in Classic, so don't expect them to work perfectly off the bat. As to how these affect the experience, well, it's the same as always. There is an informational advantage that many people will run with, and I think it's perfectly fine to want to know when things are coming in. If World of Warcraft's mechanics were designed to be reacted to rather than to be preempted, I think this would be a bit too much. But enemy behaviors were predictable for years for a reason. Really, Blizzard just never needed to solve that with, their own UI, and that's just something that add-ons have pretty much done from the beginning. Now, the same could be said for a threat meter. This is one that everyone will be running in Classic. It's called Classic Threat Meter. Now, again, this is information that's vital to group-based gameplay. Back in the day, everyone had a threat meter, and it's just something that Blizzard ought to have shown or made themselves, but never really did. So threat, more often than not, was the limiting factor on damage, and managing threat became a skill the DPS players had to learn. Without a threat meter, you'd have no warning before a mob would just start sprinting towards you. Actually knowing boss mechanics, timers, and even understanding some of the combat mechanics in more detail, what I've laid out above basically, that might not be an authentic vanilla experience for a huge portion of players. But the thing is, you can't unlearn those things, and the better players in vanilla, those who are playing the endgame, knew all of those things. So yeah, I think these add-ons are a reasonable enough thing to go with in vanilla. I mean, this is certainly how the more dedicated vanilla players will have been experiencing the game back in the day. Then there's one other add-on that would be a huge help to certain classes, and that's ClassicAuraDurations. This shows the duration of your auras in Classic. Being able to see the duration of your debuffs on targets and your buffs on raid members, that's certainly going to make the game easier, but in a pretty minor, that's just sort of nice to have way. OmniCC will actually combine with this to give you a numeric cooldown as well, which makes for just a much more enjoyable experience if you're a class that uses dots or hots. Now, it's definitely on the upper end of experience though, and there could be, a slippery slope if you're using too many add-ons like this and it's less like original Classic, but I think this is a perfectly reasonable good one to use. Then next we've got Atlasloot Classic, and honestly, before doing a bit of research and just diving into my own experience back in the day, I'd have entirely forgotten about Atlasloot. We're so used to the dungeon journal, we have been for so long, I almost forgot about the days where you had to, click that minimap button to open this up and make your way through Atlasloot's interesting interface just to find out what cool gear could come from your dungeon. Now, while our computers today will easily handle alt-tabbing to a web page of these, it still is nice to have access to the loot tables from within game, especially with the functionality to create lists. And really, just about everybody used this in vanilla, and I expect just about everyone will use this in Classic. Next, Auctionator is basically a must. While it's very different from the more common add-on of the past, Auctioneer, it basically just makes the auction house usable, and I don't see it having that much of a crazy impact on the vanilla economy, although it may make it easier for prices to follow the market a little bit closer because people will have easier access to information. In terms of reducing the needless nuisance that comes from Blizzard's auction house UI though, I could not live without it. Now, for those who really want to follow in Belluwigs' footsteps, there's TradeSkillMaster. I don't think that playing the markets is going to be the same now as it was back then, as many players understand the value of items a lot. I mean, players just understand so many more market concepts now because they've had a decade of experience working within them. So if you want to play that auction house game, you're going to have to optimize to match your opponents. And while I actually do think it's going against the experience of Classic to use modern tools that are as powerful as TradeSkillMaster, well, I think we've got to be realistic. The economy will be balanced just how it was, with a much wider variety of items that have genuine value. And I think in this case, TSM and its tools, they're going to be necessary for competitive auctioneering. It will not be the true auction house vanilla of experience, but ultimately what's going to happen is there'll be a tools arms race, and the people who drive the economy will probably be the people who use TradeSkillMaster. Then I just have three very simple add-ons for your inventory management. So if you want a bag manager with a more modern feel, Bag-On is a really good one for that. However, Inventorian, while it does scale up a little bit too large, will give you a unified bag with a more classic vibe. And then finally, vendor price is pretty simple. Whenever you mouse over an item, it'll tell you the vendor price in the tooltip, which is pretty darn handy to know. Then next, there are some add-ons that I would caution against. These add-ons are tempting, but they will change the experience away from what many people love about Classic. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't use them if you want to, but I think it's just worth letting you know about them with the correct accompanying information. Now, the more major ones to avoid, in my view, are Questie and Classic Codex. These add-ons try to make questing a lot easier by adding icons to your map for quests and telling you what quests you're able to pick up. It's a good add-on for those who want to use it, absolutely, I won't knock them there, but I'll say this, it does fundamentally change the experience of leveling to be a lot more flowchart-like. You're just going to be auto-running around dots on the map and doing what a one-liner says and then completing the text, or the quest. Add-ons like this, yes, they did exist in the older days of WoW, but they were not the default leveling experience at launch that many people had. If memory serves, the likes of Quest Helper came around closer to TBC. So yeah, you can use these, maybe they're going to be really good for your second character, but if you want that really authentic vanilla experience, I don't think they're a good option. There's also Azeroth Autopilot, you may have seen some of the speed levelers use it, and this one's pretty obvious. It will guide you through every step to a fast and smooth level 60 through questing, really just removing the need to pay attention to whatever you're doing. Now here's the thing, for the most part, leveling wasn't a chore in the old days of World of Warcraft. It was the game. You needed to engage with the world to actually know what was going on and what you were doing. With Azeroth Autopilot, though, you're only really a few steps away from botting. You're just, sitting there doing it all physically yourself. And while that's fine if you're racing to the top, for most people, Classic is about the journey. It's not a race to the top, and I would advise against using this add-on, even though I have included it in Battle for Azeroth add-on lists. Now, the next one is a bit more nuanced, and some may disagree. Weakauras 2 Classic. It is very robust in the right hands. It can be extremely powerful, provides a huge informational advantage if you set it up right, and ultimately it can do a lot of the thought work for the user. Now, I can envision Weakauras that really help with just about every single aspect of combat in Classic. Well, even things outside of combat. But that said, it's all about how you use it. I think if you're searching, wago.io for a rotation helper or something like that to remove just work from the game, I think that could be detrimental to the combat experience. But if you're using this because you want an aura to remind you to reapply your poisons, to repair your gear, or to pick up reagents for a spell and you've ran out of them, then it won't do you any real harm. If you'd rather use a Weakauras swing timer than the add-on version, maybe track some of your cooldowns without having to look at your action bars, then obviously that's not really going to change the experience to be a problem, and it's totally fine to use. So personally, I'm likely to toy around with the likes of things like, say, LVUI Classic a little bit later on, just to see what Classic feels like playing with a modern UI. But right now, yeah, I'm going to be running the bare minimum to relive a bit of the original experience, to navigate around the world myself. Many of these won't be particularly important, these add-ons won't be particularly important for the first dozen or so hours of the game, so there's plenty of time to experiment and figure out what works for you. I'd actually recommend running without add-ons for a while, because it was a really enjoyable experience playing through the truly vanilla version of the game and just getting a feel for pretty much exactly how it was back in the day without things like add-ons, because at the end of the day, that really is reliving what was the first experience in World of Warcraft for so many people. So even as a bit of context to playing WoW in general, I think it's worth doing. Anyway, there you go. That is my add-on list for Classic. That's where just where I am with add-ons on Classic and some recommendations. I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any suggestions yourself, leave them down below. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.